Okay, as in go? This is Forktales, a podcast that feeds the restaurant world. If you like what we're feeding you, please follow us on your podcast service of choice. And do give us a 5-star review. Think of it as a tip for good service. Everyone, today I am joined by my new friend, Carl Orsbourn. It's Orsborn. Say it with me, everyone. All joking aside, Carl, thanks for taking time out of your day and your week to hang out with me. Why don't you say hello? And for those that don't know you, give a little bit of backstory.
Thanks, Joseph. Really good to be here, and glad we get to spend a few minutes together today. So I'm Carl Orsbourn. I'm the COO, co-founder at JUICER, a dynamic pricing company for restaurants. But a lot of people know me for my first book that I wrote with Meredith Sandland, Delivering the Digital Restaurant. That book became a bit of a bestseller and really cemented, I think, my kind of presence in the industry and being able to talk about restaurant digitization. Before that, I was over at Kitchen United, helping the ghost kitchen world get settled, help build out their operating model. And before even that, I was in the C-store world. I used to run a 1,000-unit franchise business by the name of AMPM, $1 billion worth of revenue, about 400 million of it was food, but in a very different and somewhat more stagnated industry. And so when I moved over to the startup space, I was really excited into talking about more innovative type themes and everything that we're probably going to get into today.
That's brilliant. So admittedly, I didn't know about your C-store stint, probably more than a stint, but I will wax about that for a second. I grew up with AMPMs.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that AMPM was what you called convenience stores. Like, because I grew up with it. So growing up, it was go to the AMPM. We just said AMP, like dropped off the M, too many letters. And so I think I was maybe like 18 or 19 before I realized that, oh no, that's actually a brand name. That's not what you call C-stores. That's or like convenience stores.
Wow.
So for me, it was synonymous, like Band-Aid instead of adhesive strip. It was the same thing. So that's kind of wonderful. And I think there's a whole world that we could talk about with C-stores. Maybe not, we'll see if we get to it, but there is a discussion to be had around C-stores encroachment into the fast food and quick service space. And some of them are doing a fantastic job of it. But what I really want to dig into first and foremost is dynamic pricing, because you, of course, are a proselytizer. You have an entire company talking about it. And I want to say I'm a naysayer. I'm just highly skeptical. And I think I really want to dig into, let's talk about the good side of it. So before we butt heads against this, why don't you, for the listeners, try to clearly define what is dynamic pricing in the restaurant industry, clear up the misconceptions.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting subject. And I think you're right. It is quite divisive. It's quite divisive just as a theme. And so before I give you my version of a definition, let me tell you what I think our vision is for pricing, because we see enormous opportunity to bring pricing science to restaurants. And that's way before anything we get into around price dynamism, right? So pricing, as we know, is tremendously complex. It's a discipline. It requires expertise in data science. It requires access to lots of market data, the ability to quantify how changes in price affect demand. And these are not disciplines, I think it's fair to say, that have historically been part of the restaurant industry, right? I think it's fair to say that most restaurants price using a blunt instrument and a view on where they want to be perhaps positioned against relative to the competition and a desired, GP. So, with JUICER, what we're excited to bring is our experience on working on these problems. And my co-founders are like these clairvoyants, Joseph, because they herald from the travel and hotel industry, where they've seen all this stuff play out. And not a week goes by without them saying, yes, but we've seen this happen before. Let me tell you how this is going to play out. And it's always fun because we riff on it a bit. So restaurants now have this kind of opportunity to use these tools because the industry is undergoing a sea of change. You know, how it interacts with diners, everything I've talked about in my books. And restaurants are, for all intents and purposes now, an e-commerce category. The fact that menus are presented as pixels on a screen, not printed pages, gives us far more flexibility than in the past. And so I think that insight that restaurants can capitalize on this change in consumer interaction is giving us a more sophisticated idea about how they can price. And that's very much at the heart of our vision for JUICER. So how does dynamic pricing fit into this framework? Well, for me, it's just a fancy way to say we measure consumer demand and use algorithms to match prices to demand at that point in time.
I think so. That makes sense. So there's a prerequisite, though, right? Like you said, you're going to have to know what those outside influences are so you can affect the pricing in real time. And of course, you need digital menu boards that are more than just I'm going to make a joke, but a fire stick stuck in the back of a TV screen, which, you know, for the do-it-yourselfers, I've seen that happen many times. But essentially, what ends up manifesting, though, is pricing that changes. I wouldn't say in real time, right? I mean, it happens in real time, but it's not like a stock ticker. Like as I'm in line, I'm watching the price fluctuate from $2 for a cheap hamburger to $25 because of the outside influences. What rate or what kind of fluctuation have you seen or do you anticipate with it? Like, what are the updates? What are the refreshes? Is it daily? Is it hourly? When we're talking about the fluctuations in dynamic pricing?
Yeah, couple of things in answer to that, because the first thing I'd say is we're focused on off-premise transactions first. So you talk about this idea of standing in line and digital menu boards. I think that is to come, but I think the industry has to move a little further down the line before we start to see that becoming a major area of focus when it comes to dynamic pricing. Probably for all the reasons as to why you might be a bit of a skeptic on the subject, right? Because for me, the opportunity exists today in off-premise because consumers today are already experiencing dynamic pricing on DoorDash and Uber Eats, right? The delivery fees will change. You are empowering the customer to say, if you want to pay an extra $3, I can get it to you within 20 minutes as opposed to the advertised 40 minutes. The challenge is restaurants aren't getting any of the upside of that dynamism today. That's all going to the marketplaces. And so there's something here about really just trying to recognize that how do you actually find the best way to introduce something like this into a part of the industry that is already experiencing it. Look, you know, for me, consumers are more sophisticated than they often get credit for. You know, dynamic or demand-based pricing is built on the well understood intuition that products are more expensive when there's a high demand for a product, right? Restaurants have been doing this for ages, Joseph. You know, for happy hour menus, right? Does any diner need clarification when a drink or appetizer is less expensive before 6 p.m.? Of course not. They know that the restaurant's less busy and they're going to try and drum up more demand for it. So I think it's trying to work alongside those forces and try to help restaurants actually support what is their lowest margin channel.
Yeah. I mean, so that's a great analogy or a great example, I should say. And you're right. The prices do fluctuate then. I think most restaurants are banking on, can I keep them here past the happy hour marker so I can start to realize my margin. And I also agree. I think dynamic pricing is could be really fantastic from the monetary spreadsheet level of restaurant brands. I think where my yellow flags, I won't even call them red flags because I'm super interested or else I don't want to talk about it, right? I'm already set. I'm pretty malleable on it. But I think the challenges that we have to overcome is the brand experience. That's not me being a carpenter and only seeing nails. And what I'm getting at is if we take other industries that have adopted dynamic pricing that everyone's familiar with, like OTAs, in the travel industry. So online travel agents, I think is what that stands for, which is kind of silly, but, so like Expedia and the aggregators and things like that. And anyone that has tried to book a flight and is trying to look for different options and you realize, oh, my original flight just went up in price. which is really funny and not cool at all. That becomes a frustration point for me as a consumer. The other layer, not to pile it on, but I'm going to, is if we use hotels, let's say, as the model, the hotel still gets the benefit of managing the brand experience when the person walks through the door. We don't have that with delivery as restaurants. So yes, we do want to realize more money, but I think one of the issues outside of the fees and all the other gripes that we hear, one of the issues with that third-party delivery mechanism is we have no control over how good or bad the service is. We're just a machine. You gave us money, I made your burger. That's all I can do. So we're actually losing the things that add value incrementally to pricing. So for instance, McDonald's hamburger versus Shake Shack versus choose your gourmet burger brand, whatever, yeah, there's quality ingredients and things like that, but part of it is the touch, right? It's the way it's presented, the way it's delivered, the smile or lack thereof. Hotels get that opportunity, so if you decide that you're going to spend a little bit more money for a hotel and you walk in, you get the greeting, you get the high, the white glove, even though they're physically not there anymore, but like the white glove bellhoppy experience for more money. But if you took all of that away, it really does become a commodity. And I think that's my worry, is commoditization of restaurant brands, meaning brands don't really matter any longer. It's just quality of products, and that's it. That was a lot, sorry.
Well, no, a lot in that. Couple of things. First of all, you mentioned like airlines and the number of price changes. What we're finding right now is it's at most 2 or 3 changes a day. So just to give you an idea, we're not talking about, and I don't think it will ever get there, quite honestly, where you see that mid-transaction and that change of price. Because
so hold on. And I'm sorry, what I'm getting, just so we're clear, like literally if I'm on delta.com, sorry, Delta, I love you, but I hate you too. I search for flight from Atlanta to Phoenix, because we're talking about our RLC right now. Boom. Okay. Hey, it's $1,200 for first class, because you know how I roll. But then I go, well, maybe I want to go at 11 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. Okay. I look at the price. No, not so much. I come back to my 8 a.m. Boom, it's gone up.
It's gone. Yeah.
That's when I'm like, yeah, that's the reference.
And look, I'll give you one even worse, right? What about when Katrina happened, right? And everyone didn't have a home and they had to go into these hotels, and the hotels had 400, 500% price increases, right?
Yep.
That's where, Taylor Swift, Ticketmaster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
If we want to go to an even more recent example. That's where the challenge of dynamic pricing as a term becomes somewhat, divisive. And I think and understandably so. There's another term that someone closer to our industry started to create, and that's Uber, and they came up with the term surge pricing, right? Which is kind of in this whole space here. What we're doing at JUICER is completely avoiding anything to do with surge pricing. The pizza will never be 400%. And what we do with our approach is that we ask the restaurant, what is the range that you would like to operate within? And it might be -10 to +15%. But that means the price only ever moves in between those zones. So what we're talking about here are relatively small movements in price that don't create that level of negative reaction. And as I say, in terms of the amount of price changes, not a huge, plentiful amount, so you don't get to that delta example that you were mentioning before. So in many ways, the customer doesn't really even notice a lot of these changes. In fact, when we start putting our pricing in place, we do a few things, because guest sentiment is absolutely central to the way in which we approach this. And so before we do any pricing, we do a scan of every single reference to the customer voice in that particular restaurant unit, looking for words like expensive or too pricey and anything affiliated to value. And then we look at ratings, and then we monitor that all the way through any pricing activity so that we can see if there has been a reaction in terms of the customer voice. Now, you could say, well, that's fine for those that leave a review, but many will just vote with their feet. So we also, of course, monitor volumes, and we do diff-on-diff analysis, and we have test locations and control locations to accommodate any macro changes in the environment to really try and give a clear identification of the uplift we're able to demonstrate. And what we've been able to do so far, Joseph, is we've been able to see a lift of somewhere between 5 and 7% of off-premise margins without any detrimental effect on traffic and without any detrimental effect on guest sentiment. And I think the reason for that is twofold. One is because of the micro changes we discussed. It's not huge levels of changes. It's just trying to optimize in a certain small area at different times of day. And then secondly, is I think a lot of this is actually to do with what I mentioned at the start, and that is just getting the base pricing right, helping restaurants really understand what is the willingness to pay for a certain item for a customer. And the last thing I'll mention on this is I write for Nation's Restaurant News with Meredith every month or two, and we had an article last summer that came out around throttling. And I think this is one of the hidden diseases in off-premise right now, because throttling is something where you're closing your virtual doors to your customers because your kitchen can't cope with the amount of demand that they're facing. It's almost like a good problem to have, right? You've got so many orders coming in, but you can't cope with them, so you're going to focus on your higher margin channels, and that's the logic of why a lot of technology companies have built throttling. But that is perhaps the first time a new guest is discovering your restaurant. Right. Same with like having an abusive price, by the way. If they see a bad price on a menu, they can go, wow, that place is expensive. I'm not going to go there for date night on Saturday, even if they were just thinking about a lunch third-party experience on this particular occasion. So for me here, the point is how do you create a situation where everyone is having a benefit of dynamic pricing? How do you actually empower the guest so they feel that they have a choice? If they really want to eat from your restaurant on a Friday night at 7 p.m. when your restaurant is at its busiest, and they have to pay an extra 50, 60 cents for that item, as opposed to it being completely shut down and not available at all, what would you rather do? And similarly, if we can get to a world, and I think we will get to this type of world, where you then can incentivize and almost train the guest to be able to say, well, if you order ahead, or if you order at 6 p.m. on that Friday night, you can actually get it for a slightly cheaper price. Then isn't that actually empowering the guests? Isn't it actually empowering the restaurant to keep their guests happier by letting them have their control? That's where I think we're going to have a better experience overall.
Yeah, I don't fully disagree at all. Like, I think there's still impediments. Obviously, we're not in a perfect world, and idealism is rarely realized. But you actually just did spark something in my head with the throttling and all of that. While we're embarking on this dynamic pricing opportunity, we've already experienced dynamic timing as a good and bad thing. By the very nature of time and how busy a kitchen gets, right? So what I mean by that is you use Friday night at 7 p.m. Bro, try to get a pizza delivered. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to take you anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes sometimes, depending on where you are and what city you're in. And that's just happening by the very nature of traffic. So it's dynamic timing, right? So I know if I want to get a good pizza for Friday night, I probably should get that order in at 5 p.m. So that actually tracks and makes a lot of sense. Now, I'll maybe contradict myself here because, not contradict myself, but I do see it from the restaurant's perspective fully. And I've seen it because, being on the marketing side, I've always tried to include operations as a part of the conversation and have a voice at the table. It's important. And what I think consumers, I hate that word, but I'll use it, consumers don't realize is how much money has been taken on the chin by restaurant brands. Like, it takes a lot for them to decide to move their price. So they'll absorb a lot of costs. They'll eat into their own profit margins to prevent even a 15-cent increment. So when you start talking about the percentages of like the 10 to 15% plus minus, that makes a lot more sense than maybe a pure dynamic pricing in real time jump a la Miss Swift.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's only a certain amount of seats on a plane or in a theater, right, or an arena. So it becomes a little bit of an easier science, I would suggest, in that regard, if that's something that you want to do. But also, there's only one Taylor Swift. On a marketplace, there are hundreds of other pizza places that you can go to. And so that's the challenge today. And look, you mentioned something earlier, and I'll put my author hat back on for a second, if I may.
Yeah.
And that is, the whole idea of delivering the digital restaurant, and at some point I'll tell you about the new book, but the whole idea of it is to help restaurants understand that they have to optimize their off-premise channel. It's far more than just turning yourself on DoorDash or Uber Eats and just let that kind of channel run itself and off you go.
Right.
I don't think guests have said anything particularly good about the off-premise experience in recent times. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the guest experience for off-premise today has never been worse.
Right.
Because guests aren't getting their food in the time that it was promised. The quality of the food isn't as good as they perhaps would expect in an on-premise occasion. And ultimately, the biggest issue that's happening with off-premise today is the accuracy of whether the order was indeed fulfilled correctly. Is it the right items? Is it, as per the spec that they requested?
Right.
So, there's this thing here to be able to say, well, most restaurants today are putting on a threshold increase onto their third-party prices. And even the DoorDashes of this world are sending notes out to restaurants that are going beyond a certain threshold to say, look, if you keep doing this, we're going to reduce your presence on the platforms and reduce your appearance, if you will, which is another entire subject that we can talk about. But the point is if that's happening, then the guest is saying, well, I'm paying this much more and I'm getting an inferior product as a result. And I think all that's going to lead to is customers are going to become even more switched on to being able to know which restaurants can they rely upon, which ones are able to do this consistently, which ones are actually changing their operating system to be able to make sure they do get a better experience. And so price is a function of value, but the experience, all those table touches and things you were mentioning in your earlier question, are very much still central to it. And, in delivering the digital restaurant, we talked about how gig workers are, for all intents and purposes, your new server. Do you remember that chapter, Joseph?
Yep.
That one was all about when I was going out as a DoorDash driver myself and feeling terribly treated by the restaurants that I went into. And maybe understandably so, because I was taking tips away from their staff and things like that.
Yeah.
But the point is that if you embrace those drivers, if you give them samples of your new items on the menu, if you give them a free cup of coffee or allow them to use your restrooms, they are going to more likely, not definitely, but more likely be a better proponent of your brand and give the guests that they're servicing on your behalf a better experience. And so there are little bits and pieces that need to happen in that regard to try and bring more elements of digital hospitality into off-premise. But ultimately, it's the operation. The operation needs to get better at being able to do things to a better quality, on time, and more accurately. And all of that's going to play into whether customers see they get value from this or not.
Yeah. What was the brand? I want to say it was Chipotle, but I don't want to misattribute this, where they created a whole delivery driver experience for them to wait and hang out. Was kind of a lounge. I think it was in New York.
Buca de Beppo had a bit of reference to this in the news a few months ago. But I think there are a few that are starting to do it. So it wouldn't surprise me that Chipotle are doing it as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm surprised Inspire Brands hasn't done it either. I mean, they've invested so much in this innovation center here in Atlanta on the West Side. There's definitely the space for it. I think that's something, it makes a lot of sense. You have to start treating them as such. But then I think that starts to make some folks in the C-suite a little cringy, considering the back and forth pendulum swing that we see with labor ownership and things like that. Like if you treat them too nice, are you starting to blur the lines, right? And, we know how that goes.
But then you've got these first-party logistics software platforms, like Cartwheel, that are out there that are allowing you now to try and figure out how you wish to service different diners, perhaps your most loyal diners, with your better drivers from your own fleet. So there are ways and means by which technology is enabling you to give the best service to your most valuable customers.
Yeah, I believe Vromo is on the forefront of that as well. We had Alan Hickey on the show a little while ago. Proud Scotsman. He's going to hate
Irishman. Oh,
no,
I hate that.
He's definitely proud. He's the proudest Scotsman there ever was. I do this every so often in some of the episodes just to see if Alan's listening. And when I'm in person and I do run into him, I'll say it again. It's an ongoing joke. But yes, he is an Irishman and he is wonderful, gracious guest. But they're doing great things. So thanks for digging in so much into this. I feel like there's so much to still unpack, and I am really excited about where you're going with JUICER, which is the company that you founded to essentially tackle this thing head on. Can you tell me a little bit about Juicer before we shift gears and talk about the new book and even the original book?
Yeah, so Juicer has been around for a year and a half. My co-founders, as I mentioned earlier, have come from the travel and hospitality space. In fact, our technical co-founder Marco, he built a company called Duetto, which is one of the two remaining platforms that help hotels dynamically price. But the difference, I think, between hotels and restaurants, beyond what we've already discussed, is that hotels have revenue managers as part of the team, as part of the property team. Restaurants don't. So what Juice is trying to do is become a full service solution. And so we take 12 months worth of data, transactional data, put that through our algorithm, come up with recommended prices based on the different times of day as we've discussed. And then our team will implement those price changes. So we get given that range we talked about, maybe the -10 to the +15%, and that's it. The restaurant hands us the keys, and then we report back to them the revenue uplift we've been able to generate, the guest sentiment analysis, the volume analysis, and away we go from there. It's as simple as that. Now, it sounds simple, but there's a lot of complexity behind the actual algorithm, as you can imagine. But also, there's this piece that is a complexity that affects many restaurant technology companies, and that is integrations. Very early on into my tenure, I said to the team, look, if we have to wait to build integrations with every POS out there, this is going to be a very difficult thing to be able to implement. And what we're trying to do is to try and help restaurants see the upside of our approach so that their voice can go to their technology partners to help build the necessary integrations. Because we have teams in India, in Mexico, and in Brazil that are actually making these price changes manually today. And that's like, wow, what is that? Are you sure that's the right way of doing it? Well, it is, because that way we've got more assuredness that it's going to happen. And B, it demonstrates the uplift. And then also the restaurants are going to have the louder voice in helping the tech companies see why they need this as part of their technology platforms. It's also adopting, I don't know whether you've heard this term before, but headless commerce. Salesforce, I think, introduced it. But for those of you, your listeners that haven't heard of that, it's all, for all intents and purposes, it's a bit like a Chrome plugin, right? As opposed to being Chrome or another piece of technology to add into the tech stack. It's actually saying, no, we want to be almost like a white label solution that sits on top of your current technology providers that supports you when you are ready for dynamic pricing. And I think that's really, really important for many technology leaders out there to consider, because the problem today is that restaurants have got so many technology solutions to choose from. They've got some folks that are out there saying, oh, we do it all. We're an all-in-one solution, which isn't true. And the other are those that are very specialist in other regards. And so it's very difficult for the average restaurant owner or operator who, let's face it, remember that they didn't get into this industry because they love technology. They love food, they love hospitality, they love seeing the smiles on their guests' faces. Those are the reasons they got into it. And so technology is a necessary evil, if you will, to support the business and where it is today. And so therefore, we're trying to make things easier, I think, by building the company in this regard. It also then means the procurement practice is also a little easier as well in being able to find the necessary clients. So we certainly go direct out to restaurants, but also we're building partnerships with the likes of Oracle, with It's a Checkmate and others to try and have that automated nature so we don't actually have to have manual teams implementing it. But the best thing about it is it helps restaurants have this pricing capability without affecting anyone on the ground. And because it's just off-premise focus, it doesn't really create any distraction for them.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think the future obviously would be some sort of on-prem, maybe with less real time. Maybe it happens on the weekly or things like that. But it needs to happen for the restaurants in order for restaurants to thrive. I'm always going to be the ultimate defender of the people, or at least the brand experience. So how do you make sure that it's delivered in a way that isn't going to negatively affect the brand's experience? But like you have said, and I've even added to, it's like the brand experience is already under threat, and there are a lot of negative experiences happening. This probably isn't going to. It pales in comparison. Like if everything was perfect and you're dropping a dynamic pricing model outside of even the 15 or 10%. Then maybe there's a conversation. But I'm actually more interested on the technology side, like what's going to be done with packaging, and how can our delivery vehicles be fitted with cold and hot areas to keep food as good as possible, packaging that holds in the heat without sweat, things like that. Like it makes French fries such a bummer, man.
Well, look, in our first book, one of the chapters was called "Why Pizza Works,"
Yeah,
and there was a bunch of references into think about the amount of science and innovation that has happened to the pizza box. Right, so from the four little
absolutely.
vents around the edge to that little thing, you'll probably tell me, Joseph, whatever the little thing is in the middle, and then the little tray that it sits on. All of those little components are to ensure that when a pizza arrives at your front door, it's in the best condition possible.
That's right.
And so you're absolutely right. Packaging is it's vital with your marketing hat on. There's a great third party to first party conversion angle on the packaging, but there's also a quality angle to it as well.
Yeah, I think there's so much room for growth, and this is one of those permanent pivots. So one of the other things that happened, so I've mentioned this so many times on the show, and I apologize to the listeners, but back in 2019, I had the opportunity to speak at the Fed Summit held by Restaurant Development Design Magazine, great group of people over there at Zumba Group. And I predicted a lot of things that are happening now, not because I'm a genius, but because I know how to read. And what I didn't predict was the acceleration that would be brought on by the pandemic. What's great is a lot of the things that we're talking about now, and a lot of things that you covered in the first book that you and Meredith penned, I haven't had a chance to read the second one, sorry, have come to fruition. And it's no longer this sluggish dip the toe, maybe the second toe into the water. We are full plunge into digital transformation. And that is essentially the topic of you and Meredith's work in general from all your thought leadership. So can you give maybe like a quick hit on the first book, why it's interesting, why people should grab it? And then I want to make sure you have enough time to talk about this second book, because I didn't give Meredith any time to talk about it, and I still feel bad about it.
Yeah, and absolutely. Well, it is a sequel to Delivering the Digital Restaurant, Your Roadmap to the Future of Food. That was the name of the first book. And that was written in the early days of the pandemic. We were into the outline. I think we spoke to a big publisher and they said, yeah, we'll get this out, but it'll be 2022. And we went, this is happening right now. Restaurants need this. So we had to go through a hybrid publishing path. And we wrote it to help restaurants see the why behind digitization, but being, off premise, and that consumers were hungry for better ways to engage with restaurants, and that it wasn't the evil tech companies or VCs forcing the change to happen, but it was the consumer that was driving this to happen. And of course, timing couldn't have been better for us in writing and getting that book out at that time. The book became an international bestseller. We've just got the Romanian Restaurant Association, would you believe, agreed to translate it into Romanian. So I wasn't thinking the first foreign language translation would be Romanian, but thank you, Romania.
Yeah.
But the fact that at this time in 2021, every restaurant became a ghost kitchen overnight. They were forced to embrace digitization to survive, and it really was a spray and pray type approach just to keep in business. But the second book, now we're in a different phase. Restaurants are spending somewhere between 2 and 4% of revenue on technology. I'd hasten to guess that they're spending that across 15 to 20 different pieces of technology. And those different pieces of technology are probably just not being used to their optimal capability. And they're certainly not talking to each other, these different technologies, in a way that restaurants really want them to. So our new book is called Delivering the Digital Restaurant, The Path to Digital Maturity. And it's with the pandemic in the rearview mirror. We believe that restaurants are now in a place where they're trying to consolidate their focus, where they want to deploy their resources, where they want to deploy concentrated effort to build the right foundations that support a digital transformation. Because we're still in it, right? We're still in the trenches on transforming this industry digitally. And restaurants are now largely moving on from begrudgingly accepting off-premise channels, where they were, to now seeing them as a vital part of the restaurant growth agenda. But many restaurants have that kind of scattergun focus, as I mentioned. And so I think many now have got solutions, technology solutions, because there are so many of them scattered across the entire restaurant ecosystem, and they're not really using them to their best potential. And so the new book helps restaurants see this path. It explains in a linear fashion where restaurants should focus and when. And I hope it's going to help them find their place on this path, and from that, give them more confidence on where to focus. It's a different type of book to the first. You'll remember the first. It was quite, there's 100 or so interviews with executives that we spoke to. It was a little academic, if you will, very businessy. This one's more of a playbook. It's got tips. It's got worksheets at the back of each chapter. So the reader can self-assess, reflect, consider the lessons in the context of their own restaurant. And through it, hopefully they can chart their path towards, greater maturity. And it asks them to consider some serious questions of themselves. And, it leads towards a new restaurant category that we believe is emerging, a category that we think is going to represent some of the highest levels of growth available in the industry. But the title of that chapter, when we discuss that, is called Disrupt Yourself. And it's saying, consider how you need to optimize if you had a blank sheet of paper. If you were starting your business afresh right now, what would you do? And we introduced this term of the digital native restaurant and the digital native brands, and how that is a channel that is going to move more of the costs into food, out of labor, out of rent, and that everything will be focused on digital and fully focused on off-premise occasions. And we think that category, much like fast casual before it, will actually be very, very exciting. And then we also talk to the technologists, much like we've been touching on today. Anyone in restaurant tech will want to read the book, because if we're really going to help restaurants reach digital maturity, we have to find faster, better ways to enable tech solutions to talk to each other in a symbiotic way, or just build our technology operating systems differently. A bit like the App Store, if you will, for restaurants. Could you imagine that?
Yeah.
I'd love to see a world, Joseph, where one input affects a restaurant in a symbiotic fashion, affecting other functions. An interdependability of functionality that drives better decision making and a smoother implementation of change. That today the average restaurant GM has to navigate these factors. Can you imagine, for example, where if a supplier cost increase comes through, that's like one simple data input change can then have an autonomous effect on recipes, inventory management, menu build, menu optimization, pricing, training documentation, and on and on. The example I was using on a podcast the other day was, imagine you're in a restaurant and 2 line cooks call out tonight. The GM has to deal with that today. There's no piece of technology that's saying, how do I solve for that? So imagine if that technology could then talk to OpenTable to restrict the amount of table reservations, or talk to JUICER and increase the off-prem prices a little bit more, as opposed to just talking to 7 shifts and payroll systems.
Right.
That's the way in which technology needs to evolve, so that we can help restaurants really optimize the experience, not just for off-premise, but for on-premise as well, right? So the book is quite practical in that regard. I think 70 to 80% of restaurants are probably in the first 2 chapters, where we talk about third-party optimization and converting to the first. But as I've touched on, it goes into a bit more of the futurist stuff as we get towards the end.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. The first book was great read. I definitely turned the pages yellow with my highlighter. I'm one of those. I still read the physical book and still highlight things. So I can only imagine the second one's going to be even better. I wrote an article about removing the word pivot. I'd like to commend you for not using that word, mainly because pivoting keeps you anchored with one foot. And I think that's what you're talking about with disrupting yourself. I think what ends up happening, especially the larger you get, is making those cataclysmic shifts requires you to lift the foot. It can't be a pivot. It has to be movement forward. It has to be a change of direction or a narrowing of focus, or a mix of both. And so many leaders are just crippled by the fear of what that means, of uncementing one of your feet in order to go. Because if you keep your foot planted, you really can only go so far before you've stretched too thin. And then you have a young, more agile company that will easily surpass you, or at least have a competitive edge in their agility to do so. And so I think it's such a fantastic time to be a part of this industry with everything that's happening. I will say that you have nudged me closer to an advocate of at
I'll
least.
Take it. I'll take that for today.
Yeah, it's a few steps closer. I would say it's equivalent to the number of steps closer that Meredith got me on the topic of gas ranges versus induction heat ranges that are digital. I will still fight to the death over my gas range at home, but I really appreciate the insights. And I know there's so much more. I mean, man, I had so many things that I wanted to ask you, but I also like to keep these around the 30-minute mark. So like I said to Meredith, maybe we should just do the first ever 3-person podcast where we have you and her on, and we can just really start to dig into some of these topics together, because I don't think this conversation stops today.
No, I'd love that. I mean, we set out to do this to help the industry, and so hopefully our 2 books do that. And I think podcasts like your own, Joseph, are very much part of that journey as well. So we're all in it together, and I think the more we we talk about these things, the more we're going to help the industry move forward to.
Absolutely. So I have one final question. It's the hardest one ever. And then I'll get you to drop some plugs on where to buy the book and where to find Juicer. So first, the most difficult question in the world. If you had one final meal, what would you eat? Where would you eat it and why?
Well, this one kind of comes back to one of my favorite dining experiences of my life so far. And in many ways, it's not so much about the food. The food was freshly caught fish. But this was about, I'd say half a mile, three quarters of a mile via dragon boat off the shores of Phuket, Thailand. And I went out on this dragon boat, and there's this floating pontoon which they've built. And there are some tables on top of this pontoon. And in the middle, there's a hole where they give you a net and they say, choose your dinner.
Oh, wow.
And you put the net in, you choose the fish, and then they cook the fish. And I remember sitting there with my wife and overlooking the kind of hills of Phuket. The sun was setting. It was beautiful. And I think that goes to show about just how occasions and moments like that are just as important as the quality of the food as well. So I'd probably go with something like that.
Yeah, I would not blame you. That sounds amazing. Great answer. Great answer. Where is the preferred place to pick up the books?
Well, you see, this comes back to third party, first party. If you like third parties and the flexibility that comes with them, Amazon, of course, has a Kindle version, a hardback, a paperback. The audio book is read by me. It's going to be out a month or so from now. So Amazon, of course, is the place to go to for that. But if you want to support first party, then you can head to www.deliverinthedigitalrestaurant.com. And there you'll be able to get a copy of our book. Or if you'd like to get a case of books for your team or for clients, then that's the place to get discounted copies in bulk as well. So deliverinthedigitalrestaurant.com for first party. And we also have our own podcast there that we put out every couple of weeks called The Digital Restaurant, where we just have 10, 15 minutes between Meredith and myself talking about 5 of the top articles affecting off-premise technology and restaurants. And so that's another place for your podcast listeners to head to if they're interested.
That's great. Guys, go first party. I know Amazon's convenient. It's awesome. But look, it puts more money in authors' pockets when you go first party. I should know. I prefer people to go to my website to get my book. But yeah, I understand convenience is oftentimes the winner. And then Juicer, how can we connect with Juicer?
Great. Well, with Juicer, you can obviously reach out to me on LinkedIn, but our website is juicerpricing.com. There you'll be able to fill out an inquiry. Would love to chat to you. We're particularly focused right now on restaurant groups of 20 units or more. But if you've got an off-premise business that's sizable, I think we can help you. So I'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your insights. Again, 30, 40 minutes is just not enough time. And we'll have to do this again very soon.
Looking forward to it, Joseph. Thank you so much.
If you love what we served up, please follow us at Vigor Branding on Instagram and LinkedIn. Forktales is produced by the team at Vigor, a Pavone Group company. Audio and post-production provided by Zencastr and the Pavone Group team. Music performed by Jet Trash and licensed through musicbed.com. Joseph handles his own hair, makeup, and stunts.